Geopolitical risk continues to move higher on board agendas. Whether it's uncertainty in the Eurozone or the ripple effect of conflicts in the Ukraine and the Middle East, geopolitics matters to business from both a strategy and a risk perspective. This quarter, we've invited Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group, to share his thoughts on the geopolitical landscape and how it's shaping business decisions and boardroom discussions. Here are the highlights.
Why is all this happening? And it's happening precisely because the ability of the geopolitical order to maintain coherence is disintegrating. Right? During the Cold War, we had a geopolitical environment that was actually it was very dangerous, but it was very stable. When the Soviet Union collapsed for 25 years, we had an environment that was actually very unstable, but not very dangerous. We're now entering an environment which is both unstable and dangerous. Wherever we look in the headlines today, we're seeing geopolitical issues that clearly have a very direct impact on markets and on the investment decisions that are being taken by corporations all over the world.
So Ian, against that backdrop, obviously the United States has had a historical global leadership role, and they're starting to move away from that. And you went through quite a few countries in your discussion there. Doesn't necessarily sound like any of them are ready to step into or able to step into the void. Is there anyone out there that could step into that and provide global leadership in this unstable and increasingly unstable environment?
Well, look, a lot of countries are stepping into voids, but they're not stepping into global voids, and they're stepping into local voids in very different ways with different implications. So the first point I would say is I do not believe the United States is moving towards isolationism at all. I think what's interesting is the Americans are becoming much more unilateralist. They're working less with allies. And, some of that is the energy revolution and the fact the U.S. doesn't feel it needs the Middle East as much. Some of it is the backlash from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't go so well. But some of it is that the tools that the Americans are using to project power, like surveillance, very interventionist, like drones, very interventionist, like sanctions against enemies and allies, very interventionist, are things you don't necessarily need to collaborate with other countries to affect.
What about oil prices? What impact is oil going to have on the landscape? What should we take from it from a challenge perspective? And how should board members be thinking about it in the context of geopolitical stability?
If oil prices stay in a 40 to 60 range, and I feel reasonably comfortable saying that that's something we can think about for the next year or two, and there can be outliers, but we're not going back to 120. Not with the energy revolution, not with demand destruction being where it is, and all of the new finds that are happening around the world. If that's the case, then the Saudis, who have a hell of a lot more money than Venezuelans, but they're running major deficits right now, they're not going to cut off what they spend domestically, but they will cut off spending in the region. And so when you look at countries like Lebanon, like Egypt, like Jordan, with massive refugee issues, with yawning needs fiscally, you're going to suddenly see the Gulf Arab states saying no mas, and that's going to be a very serious knock-on effect for the Middle East in the next 12, 18 months. Another point is that Putin, who is very popular because of telling the Westerners that he's not going to just sit down and roll over on Ukraine. That's worked well for him in Russia, but oil prices going down has not worked so well for him. He's now in more of a corner. Inflation is going through the roof. Imports into Russia down about 42% year on year. That really impacts the average Russian consumer. It's been hard to maintain the ruble in a stable place. And as we look out over the next year or two, that's going to make him more insecure. It's going to make him feel like he's in a corner. It's going to make him lash out more against the West. And that just doesn't mean Ukraine. That means overflight into NATO countries. It means the potential for accidents with European commercial airliners, things that will make the European markets very vulnerable indeed. Final point, this low energy environment, the single largest individual beneficiary in the world is Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is transforming the Chinese economy, and he now has some tailwinds to help him out because he can smooth the ability of state-owned enterprises, particularly in the extractive sectors, to actually slow down but with lower prices. And they can rationalize credit, make money cost what it should, but also implement policies that will help to reduce things like poor air quality in core cities in China, which is such a problem for the average citizen living there. Put all of that together, it means that China can actually slow growth more without experiencing the social backlash internally or the political backlash among the elites. That's really good for China in the short to medium term. It's problematic for the countries that have benefited so much by selling commodities into China over the past 35 years. So the countries that get hit, Brazil, which is already growing at basically zero, a country like Australia, like Indonesia. I mean, those are the knock-on effects. So when you really look at oil prices going from 100 plus to 50, it's one thing to look at, okay, who are the core oil producers and they're going to have problems, but it's actually the second order effects that are most interesting, and frankly the ones that have the greatest impact for the board members, because the exposures of those companies are not so much in Saudi Arabia, but they are, of course, in Europe, they are in China, and they're affected by the macro drivers that the success or failure of those economies will bring to the rest of it.
You talk about Russia, add to it China, the Middle East. Folks that are listening to the webcast today, obviously, you're doing business in those areas, countries, regions. What tips do you have for them looking today, given the shifting landscape, the challenges in the landscape? What tips would you have for companies doing business in those areas today?
They're very different tips. I mean, in Russia, the primary tip is you got to limit your exposure. And most companies that have exposure in Russia have already done that. And that's true whether they're hotels or whether they're luxury brands. It's true if they're energy companies. It's true if they're selling automobiles. Everyone's taken a whack in Russia. On the Middle East, life is very different. Actually, I think given that China is going to need a hell of a lot more energy going forward and they're going to buy it from the Middle East, you're going to see the Emirates become the global hub for the trade of petro RMB. And the amount of money that's going to pile into the Emirates will be extraordinary. So that they're going to do much better. Dubai and Abu Dhabi, more diversified, more open, and everyone sees that as the place to go. And all these countries I'm worried about, what happens to Egypt, what happens to Jordan, what happens to Lebanon, those people still have credible businesses. They still need to do business, but no one's going to go to their countries to do it. So where are they going to go? They're going to do that business in the Emirates. And so that really becomes a very large hub, and it's worth doubling down on that bet in my view. The countries like Saudi Arabia and the major Gulf Arab states will be more coordinated. They won't have a common currency, but they will have more common security policies. They'll hang together better, and they'll stay pretty stable. So those countries, I think, will be fine from an investment perspective, even though clearly the energy market's going down, going to limit their discretionary spend. China, of course, is a radically different story. It's stable. It is growing, and yes, that growing is going down, but from a much higher base. It's becoming richer. It's becoming more resilient as a consequence. Even if China were to implode, if they implode from a per capita income of 10,000 as opposed to 2,000, then implosion means much softer things. It means the elites play a bigger role even in what comes after the Communist Party. So you're not taking as much risk there as you used to, but you are taking lots of risk when the Chinese government is continuing to actively support national champions. That is particularly true in areas where they consider them strategic. And what's interesting about China is what they decide is strategic can change over time. It does change over time. So you have to watch very carefully, sort of what are the sectors, the nascent sectors that the Chinese are going to start plowing money into because they believe that they can have world-beating brands.
All right, let's bring it home. On this last slide, we've got some considerations for the board.
Yep.
And if you look at it, it seems in a lot of respects pretty basic stuff. And in fact, when I talk to board members, they tell me what I'm really concerned about is the risk of what I don't know. But I think there's another risk here, and that's connecting the dots. So one tip or two tips that you might have for our board members out there about how to think about things, how to connect things, and how to relate things back to your tactical and strategic business objectives.
Well, I think first of all, kind of almost management 101, but because geopolitics is such a new field and a lot of corporations aren't used to it, look, CEOs frequently like talking about these things because they're going to be in the mix with heads of state and ministers, and so they develop a certain panache around it, at least a patter. But that doesn't mean that there's anyone in the organization underneath them that actually understands what to do with this information. And it also needs to be consolidated, right? Because if it's going out to localities, they're going to use it and they're going to go native, right? They're going to say there's a big difference between BP and ExxonMobil. Right, where you're talking to your local guy in Azerbaijan and he's basically doing everything he can to just make his numbers and he doesn't want to hear anything else. So I think as a board you need to understand, is it your chief global strategist? Is it your head of international business development? Who are the people in the organization, not just the CEO, that actually have the ability to process this information in a strategic way to actually make sure that it is being implemented and affecting long-term business making decisions, and furthermore can actually communicate effectively with the board? right? Those are important things, because if it's just the CEO, this stuff isn't going to work. That's one thing. A second thing is actually understanding, especially when you're talking about exposure to China, exposure to Europe, you need to do some real scenario planning around under what conditions would you, given just how much volatility there will be in the geopolitical environment, I think boards need to understand under what conditions would they change dramatically their present business model with some of their international exposures. And that's most important with China and Europe, right? Because that's where lots of things could potentially happen in the coming years that are just radically different from what these boards have baked into their business models. And I think we have to understand that the reason why, there are a lot of reasons you're seeing creative destruction in the geopolitical environment. One is US unilateralism, one is European incoherence, one is Russian decline, but the big one is the rise of China. And the fact is that when China becomes the world's largest economy, it is going to have vastly greater uncertainty and trajectory than any other major economy in the world. That necessarily means that the quality of 4% growth in the world has just gone down, right? The quality of your returns has gone down. And it means that the necessity of the board to do more out of the box what if planning around that has just gone significantly up. And I really don't see that many boards taking that on seriously.